like to welcome you to the first of two Notable Books programs. The second is February 22nd, addressing the topic, Why Mansfield Park is Better Than Pride and Prejudice. I'm David Bell. I'm sure all of you know me from previous programs. And let me begin by introducing this afternoon's all-star cast. To my right is Rachel Dodge. She's been a featured speaker at both the library's How Ostentatious and Notable Books program. And did any of you attend the tea last? Okay. And last month, at last month's Jane Austen tea, she delivered a talk on Mansfield Park, so absorbing that the audience put aside their food and gave her their full attention. Then we have two special guests, well-known actors, both members of the ambitious Big Idea Theater on Del Paso Boulevard, and possibly familiar faces to many of you. First, would you raise your hand? Ryan Schneider. Ryan Snyder, you may remember 2 years ago he played Mr. Darcy in the Sacramento Theater's company stage adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. And to his right, we have Jamie Kale. Last year, Jamie played Annie in Tom Stoppard's The Real Thing at Capitol Stage. Those of you who are regular Notable Books attenders know that Notable Books did two programs on The Real Thing in collaboration with Cap Stage, in one of which Jamie took part. Now, those of you who saw the play, The Real Thing, might remember that Ryan had a small part, appearing only in the final scene as Private Brody. Just before the curtain, Annie tosses a bowl of dip in Private Brody's face. Jamie and Ryan were married last September, and I'm sure that since then, Jamie has never had occasion to wish she had a bowl of dip ready at hand. Real popular of Austen's novels. In this afternoon's program and next month's, with the help of our actors, Rachel and I will address this question, arguing with impeccable logic, disarming humor, and compelling evidence that the novel does not deserve this neglect, that in fact it is a better novel than its much-loved predecessor. So let's begin by immediately putting Jamie and Ryan to work, reading one of the scenes that makes Pride and Prejudice such a favorite with readers. I think you'll recognize this scene immediately.
Believe me, my dear Miss Elizabeth, that your modesty, so far from doing you any disservice, rather adds to your other perfections. You would have been less amiable in my eyes had there not been this little unwillingness. But allow me to assure you that I have your respected mother's permission for this address. You can hardly doubt the purport of my discourse, however your natural delicacy may lead you to dissemble. My attentions have been too marked to be mistaken. Almost as soon as I entered the house, I singled you out as the companion of my future life. But before I run away with my feelings on the subject, perhaps it will be advisable for me to state my reasons for marrying and, moreover, for coming to Hertfordshire with the design of selecting a wife, as I certainly did. The reasons for my marrying are, first, that I think it a right thing for every clergyman in easy circumstances, like myself, to set the example of matrimony in his parish. Secondly, that I am convinced it will add very greatly to my happiness. And thirdly, which perhaps I ought to have mentioned earlier, that it is the particular advice and noble lady patroness Twice has she condescended to give me her opinion, unasked too, on the subject, and it was but the very Saturday night before I left Hunsford, between our pools at Quadrille, while Mrs. Jenkinson was arranging Mr. Berg's footstool, that she said, "Mr. Collins, you must marry. A clergyman like you must marry. Choose properly. Choose a gentlewoman for my sake and for your own. Let her be an active, useful sort of person, not brought up high, but able to make a small income go a good way. This is my advice. Find such a woman as soon as you can, bring her to Hunsford, and I will visit her. Allow me, by the way, to observe, my fair cousin, that I do not reckon the notice of the kindness of Lady Catherine de Bourgh as among the least of the advantages in my power to offer. You will find her manners beyond anything I can describe, and your wit and vivacity, I think, must be acceptable to her, especially when tempered with the silence and respect which her rank will inevitably excite. Thus much for my general intention in favor of matrimony. It remains to be told why my views were directed to Longbourn instead of my own neighborhood, where I assure you there are many amiable young women. But the fact is that, being as I am to inherit this estate after the death of your honored father, who, however, may live many years longer, I could not satisfy myself without resolving to choose a wife from among his daughters, that the loss to them might be as little as possible when the melancholy event takes place, which, however, as I have already said, may not be for several years. This has been my motive, my fair cousin, and I flatter myself it will not sink me in your esteem. And now nothing remains for me but to assure you in the most animated language of the violence of my affection. To fortune I am perfectly indifferent, and shall make no demand of that nature on your father, since I am well aware that it could not be complied with, and that £1,000 and the 4%, which will not be theirs till after your mother's decease, is all that you may ever be entitled to. On that head, therefore, I shall be uniformly silent, and you may assure yourself that no ungenerous reproach shall ever pass my lips when we are married.
You are too hasty, sir. You forget I have made no answer. Let me do it without further loss of time. Accept my thanks for the compliment you're paying me. I'm very sensible to the honor of your proposal, but it seems impossible for me to do otherwise than to decline them.
I am not now to learn that it is usual with young ladies to reject the address of the man whom they secretly mean to accept when he first applies for their favor, and that sometimes the refusal is repeated a second or even a third time. I am therefore by no means discouraged by what you have just said, and hope to lead you to the altar ere long.
Upon my word, sir, your hope is rather an extraordinary one after my declaration. I do assure you that I am not one of those young ladies, such young ladies there are, who are so daring to risk their happiness on the chance of being asked a second time. I am perfectly serious in my refusal. You could not make me happy, and I'm convinced I'm the last woman in the world who could make you so. And hey, your friend Lady Catherine, to know me, I am persuaded she would find me very ill qualified for the situation.
Were it certain that Lady Catherine would think so, but I cannot imagine that her ladyship would at all disapprove of you. And you may be certain that when I have the honor of seeing her again, I shall speak in the highest terms of your modesty, economy, and other amiable qualifications.
Indeed, Mr. Collins, all praise of me would be unnecessary. You must give me leave to judge for myself and pay me the compliment of believing what I say. I wish you very happy and very rich, and by refusing your hand, do all in my power to prevent your being otherwise. In making me the offer, you must have satisfied the delicacy of your feelings with regard to my family, and may take possession of Longbourn Estate whenever it falls, without any self-reproach. This matter may be considered, therefore, as finally settled.
Speaking to you next on this subject, I shall hope to receive a more favorable answer than you have just given me. Though I am far from accusing you of cruelty at present, because I know it to be the established custom of your sex to reject a man on the first application. Perhaps you have been now said as much to encourage my suit as would be not appear to me that my hand is unworthy of your acceptance, or that the establishment I could offer would be any other than highly desirable. My situation in life, my connections with the family of de Burgh, and my relationship to your own are circumstances highly in my favor, and you should take into further consideration that in spite of your manifold attractions, it is by no means certain that another offer of marriage may ever be made to you. Your fortune is unhappily so small that it will in all likelihood undo the effects of your loveliness and amiable qualifications. As I must therefore conclude that you are not serious in your rejection of me, I shall choose to attribute it to your wish of increasing my love by suspense according to the usual practice of elegant females.
I do assure you, sir, that I have no pretension whatsoever to that kind of elegance which consists in tormenting a respectable man. I would rather be paid the compliment of being believed sincere. I thank you again and again for the honor you have done me in your proposal, but to accept them is absolutely impossible. My feelings in every respect forbid it. Can I speak plainer? Do not consider me now as an elegant female intending to plague you, but as a rational creature speaking the truth in her heart.
Inform me. And I am persuaded that when sanctioned by the express authority of both your excellent parents, my proposals will not fail of being acceptable.
Who can resist the high spirits and youthful exuberance of scenes like this? How could anyone not be captivated by the charms of this delightful book and its equally delightful heroine? Let's now go to some background about the writing of Pride and Prejudice. Jane Austen was a child prodigy. Born in 1775, the daughter of a country clergyman, she started writing at the age of 11 or 12 to entertain her family. She began what would become Sense and Sensibility when she was 19, and what would become Pride and Prejudice when she was 20. A year later, she began yet another novel she called Susan. So before she was 24, she had completed 3 novels. Then between 1801, when her father retired and moved the family to Bath, and 1809, Austen had no fixed abode and did very little writing. Though Susan was sold for publication, but much to Austen's disappointment, never published. Years later, Austen bought back the copyright, and the novel was finally published by her brother the year after her death. The title changed to Northanger Abbey. Once Austen settled into Chawton Cottage in 1809, she returned to her first 2 novels, revising both Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, which was published in early 1813. Mansfield Park was the first novel Austen began in her maturity. She started working on it, and I think this is important. She started working on it at the same time she was revising Pride and Prejudice. She clearly made a conscious decision to try something different and not to spend the rest of her career writing more Pride and Prejudices, which she undoubtedly would have been very good at. What's not to like about Pride and Prejudice? A witty, high-spirited, but decidedly underfunded heroine lands a tall, handsome, good-principled, and extremely wealthy husband. Unfortunately, there's not a Darcy available for every deserving young lady in financially precarious circumstances, just as Charlotte Lucas. Pride and Prejudice is about life as we wish it would be. Mansfield Park is about life as it is. At the age of 35, when Austen began work on Mansfield Park, she had matured as an artist. She knew it was time to venture beyond the youthful high spirits of her earlier work and challenge herself with something far more difficult. She was ready to move on, and as mature readers, we should be ready to move on with her. I love Pride and Prejudice and come back to it whenever I need cheering up. Lizzie gets her Darcy and all's right with the world. No wonder Pride and Prejudice has always been so popular with high school girls. The story is so romantic, the ending so reassuring and satisfying. But when I want to experience the deeper satisfaction of a novel that wrestles with the realities of life, then I turn to Mansfield Park. This afternoon, Rachel and I would like to give you a sense of the richness and complexity of Mansfield Park, the extraordinary ways that Austen blends language, character, and plot into a novel quite unlike anything she had written before. Except in passing, we will not be saying much about the heroine of Mansfield Park, Fanny Price. She will be the focus of next month's session. This time, we will explore the subplots. First, the flirtation between Fanny's cousin, Maria Bertram, engaged to the dull, foolish, but very wealthy Mr. Rushworth, and the talented, attractive Henry Crawford. Second, the growing attraction between Edmund Bertram and Mary Crawford. Edmund is a straight-laced young man intending to become a clergyman. Mary is a fashionable, wealthy, London-bred young woman who has no interest in rural living and can't imagine herself mistress of a country vicarage. It would seem that they are the last two people to find each other appealing, and yet they are drawn to one another almost in spite of themselves. Austen explores these two relationships, that between Henry Crawford and Maria Bertram, and that between Mary Crawford and Edmund Bertram, in the remarkable first volume of Mansfield Park. She does so primarily in two extended episodes. The first takes place at Sotherton, the estate of Maria's fiancé, Mr. Rushworth. Takes place, and the Bertram children decide to perform a play. Private theatricals, as they were called, were all the rage at the time. They decide to perform a play while their father, Sir Thomas, is away in the West Indies. Well, let's first go to Sotherton, where Maria and Henry have ample opportunity to pursue their flirtation. Rachel will be our guide through this scene.
We are all familiar with the Sotherton Chapel scene, I hope, in which Maria and Mr. Crawford flirt quite openly at the altar. However, it is when the party moves outdoors that we see Austen's genius for subtlety and sexual innuendo. Outdoors, there is no longer even the facade of an Aunt Norris chaperone. The usual drawing room and ballroom decorum and restraint are dropped, and the characters begin to move and speak more freely. Only Fanny stands as the voice of reason and propriety, but she is quickly disposed of on a bench. The young people are then as free to roam as they please, and roam they do. When we get to volume 1, chapter 10, it opens with Fanny sitting forlorn on the said bench, being approached by Mr. Rushworth, Maria, and Mr. Crawford. Maria is at this point feeling quite torn. As Austen comments, Maria, quote, might be said to have two strings to her bow. She had Rushworth feelings and Crawford feelings. She is full of the heady feeling that comes from being engaged to a wealthy, though uninteresting, man, while at the same time being chased by a dashing man to whom she is overwhelmingly attracted. As Maria sits down between the two men, a scene unfolds that is ripe with meaning. Although the characters appear to be speaking simply about the grounds of Southerton and a walk to view more of it, the scene is full of sexual innuendo. Austen uses the metaphor and the key to her readers the true feelings of each character. This scene also foreshadows beautifully several future plot points. Surely Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress comes to mind, as Maria coyly suggests a romp in the park, and Mr. Crawford tempts her to skip the key and skirt the gate altogether. This scene can be broken down into three major layers. The first is the most obvious layer. The three characters are exploring the grounds of Southerton and find the gate to the park locked. Mr. Rushworth goes back for the key, and while he is gone, Maria and Mr. Crawford decide to slip around the gate and go on without him. On this level, the very fact that Maria agrees to walk into the park without a chaperone is cause for concern. She is opening herself up to all kinds of problems. The fact that she goes on with Mr. Crawford and does not wait for Mr. Rushworth also makes her preference for Mr. Crawford rather obvious and public. Fanny, who observes it all, feels it is wrong and tries to make an effort to prevent it. Fanny is correct. Of course, Maria should have waited for her fiancé before proceeding into the park with another man. The second layer is the subtle flirtation between Maria and Mr. Crawford as they feel one another out and continue to test just how far the other will take their flirtatious banter. Maria is at this point intent on finding out if Mr. Crawford has any real intentions toward her. This portion of the scene comes as a parenthesis, if you will. It is sandwiched between the time when they discover the gate is locked and the time they talk of going around it into the park anyway. As Rushworth goes off to fetch the key, this leaves the other two alone, excepting Fanny, who sees everything, but no one ever seems to mind. Left to speak more openly, Maria and Mr. Crawford begin to discuss the future of Southerton and Maria as its future mistress. Now, I've given a handout if you'd like to read along. Mr. Crawford says, "I do not think that I shall ever see Southerton again with so much pleasure as I do now." Says, "Yes, sincerely, do you not find the place altogether worse than you expected?" "No, indeed, far otherwise. I find it better, grander, more complete in its style, though that style may not be the best. And to tell you the truth," speaking rather lower, "I do not think that I shall ever see Southerton again with so much pleasure as I do now. Another summer will hardly improve it to me." After a moment's embarrassment, the lady replied, "You are too much a man of the world not to see with the eyes of the world. If other people think Southerton improved, I have no doubt you will. I'm afraid I am not quite so much the man of the world as might be good for me in some points. My feelings are not quite so evanescent, nor my memory of the past under such easy dominion as one finds to be the case with men of the world." In this exchange, Mr. Crawford reveals that he does not like to think about next summer when she will belong to Southerton and its master. Maria tests him in this, saying that he will surely have forgotten her by then. He assures her that he will not forget, that he feels differently about her than all the other single ladies. I'm sure every woman here is groaning at this most famous of bad boy lines. But his words have their desired effect and convince her that she does outshine all of his other conquests. Now, Maria's feathers have been ruffled by the drive to Southerton. If you'll remember, her sister Julia rode on the barouche box with him. So she tests him further in this scene in order to find out his preference between her and Julia. In this exchange, Austen reveals that Maria's desire for Mr. Crawford is quite complex. Maria is an extremely jealous woman. Seeing her sister right up front with Mr. Crawford has caused her eyes to gleam with envy. While she loves the thrill of their flirtation and perhaps is even falling into some kind of love or lust with him, we see here that Maria's charge is also fueled by envy. She cannot stand to see any other woman, especially her sister, have a man she wants. She wants to prove that she can get Mr. Crawford if she wants to. She wants the assurance that he favors her more, and he is happy to comply. So we can continue reading. This was followed by a short silence. Miss Bertram began again. "You seem to enjoy your drive here very much this morning. I was glad to see you so well entertained. You and Julia were laughing the whole way." "Were we? Yes, I believe we were, but I have not the least recollection at what. Oh, I believe I was relating to her some ridiculous stories of an old Irish groom of my uncle's. Your sister loves to laugh. You think her more light-hearted than I am. More easily amused, he replied. Consequently, you know, smiling, better company. I could not have hoped to entertain you with Irish anecdotes during a 10 miles drive. Naturally, I believe I am as lively as Julia, but I have more to think of now. You have, undoubtedly, and there are situations in which very high spirits would denote insensibility. Your prospects, however, are too fair to justify want of spirits. You have a very smiling scene before you. Do you mean literally or figuratively? Literally, I conclude. Yes, certainly, the sun shines and the park looks very cheerful. But unluckily, that iron gate, that ha-ha, give me a feeling of restraint and hardship. I cannot get out, as the starling said. So Mr. Crawford succeeds in smoothing her ruffled feathers and subtly reminds her that if he has given any attention to Julia, it is only because they are all on a journey to visit Mariah's future estate. In addition, at the end of this passage, Austen reveals another element at the heart of Mariah's desires. She longs for romantic excitement. She, like most of us, would like to marry someone with whom she feels that spark. Marrying for anything less than love now pales in comparison with the exciting attraction she feels for Mr. Crawford. She must be thinking, if only I had met him first. Though being on the ground first had a consequence of Mr. Rushworth and his status, the fact of the matter is she is not attracted to Rushworth. In comparison with the staid and boring Mr. Rushworth, Mr. Crawford, with all of his charm and enjoyment of life, thrills Mariah to the core. Now, the third layer is perhaps the most fun, especially coming from Austen, because it is ripe with sexual innuendo. Austen uses the locked gate and key metaphor to bookend this scene that I've just explained, in order to show the sexual tension that is growing between Mariah and Mr. Crawford as they spar and flirt with one another, as well as the love triangle that is formed between Mr. Rushworth, Mariah, and Mr. Crawford. We can surely imagine what a locked gate, the key that will allow the gate to swing open, and the park beyond might represent to Austen's audience. Through this metaphor, Austen reveals the impotence of Mr. Rushworth. He is slow-witted and cannot keep up, literally and figuratively. He has the key to the gate, but unfortunately, Mariah is not interested in his particular key. She doesn't want to explore the metaphorical park with him. She wants to explore it alone with Mr. Crawford. Mr. Rushworth simply cannot compete with the charm and the wit and the raw masculinity that Mr. Crawford possesses. So instead of waiting for the key, Mariah would much rather slip past the gate and explore the park with Mr. Crawford. And I'm coming back again to this scene that's at the first part now. Pay close attention to the metaphor of the locked gate and key. After some minutes spent in this way, Miss Bertram, observing the iron gate, expressed a wish of passing through it into the park, that their views and their plans might be more comprehensive. It was the very thing of all others to be wished. It was the best, it was the only way of proceeding with any advantage, in Henry Crawford's opinion. And he directly saw a knoll not half a mile off, which would give them exactly the requisite command of the house. Go therefore they must to that knoll. Mr. Rushworth wished he had brought the key. He had been very near thinking whether he should not bring the key. He was determined he would never come without the key again, but still this did not remove the present evil. They could not get through. And as Miss Bertram's inclination for doing so did by no means lessen, it ended in Mr. Rushworth's declaring outright that he would go and fetch the key. He set off accordingly. Here we see that both men want to pass through the gate and explore the park with Mariah, but man wouldn't. However, while Mr. Rushworth is willing to go about it in the proper way, through the proper channels, Mr. Crawford is not. Upon finding the gate locked, Mr. Rushworth goes to get the key. His first mistake, never leave your oversexed fiancé with a known womanizer. But beyond the actual physical metaphor of a key fitting into a lock, Austen's contemporary audience would have most certainly also seen the key as it relates to matrimony. To unlock the gates of sexual intimacy, one must have the matrimonial key. Unlike Mr. Rushworth, Mr. Crawford is not interested in obtaining the key. Instead, he only wants to sidestep the gate and roam the park free of charge. After Miss Mariah and Mr. Crawford sit together and talk on the bench for a few minutes, they grow impatient. They want to go and explore. The lure of having time alone is far too tempting to resist. And so Mariah brings up the topic of the closed gate again. As she spoke, and it was with expression, she walked to the gate. He followed her. "Mr. Rushworth is so long fetching this key." I, for one, think she hopes he'll never find it. "And for the world you would not get out without the key and without Mr. Rushworth's authority and protection, or I think you might with little difficulty pass round the edge of the gate here with my assistance. I think it might be done if you really wished to be more at large and could allow yourself to think it not prohibited." Of course he would like to assist her in being more at large. "Prohibited nonsense. I certainly can get out that way, and I will. Mr. Rushworth will be here in a moment, you know. We shall not be out of sight. Or if we are, Miss Price will be so good as to tell him that he will find us near that knoll, the grove of oak on the knoll." Fanny, feeling all this to be wrong, could not help making an effort to prevent it. "You will hurt yourself, Miss Bertram," she cried. "You will certainly hurt yourself against those spikes. You will tear your gown. You will be in danger of slipping into the ha-ha. You had better not go." Fanny is correct. Mariah certainly is on the way to hurting herself and in danger of slipping into a ditch. Her cousin was safe on the other side while these words were spoken, and smiling with all the good humor of success, she said, "Thank you, my dear Fanny, but I and my gown are alive and well, and so goodbye." We see here Austen's genius with metaphor as she lays this on thick. The idea of spikes, a torn gown, and slipping into a ditch are an easily deciphered description for her readers' imaginations. The word picture Austen paints as these two characters step closer and closer to impropriety are vivid and meaningful. Mr. Crawford subtly dares Mariah to proceed without the protection of a third party, and Mariah, full of pride, curiosity, and hormones, cannot resist. As the pair walks away together, we as readers do not get to see what occurs when they are alone. However, we do know that it does not result in Mariah breaking off her engagement. He obviously does not go down on one knee and beg her to leave Mr. Rushworth. When at the end of the afternoon everyone comes back to the house, Austen says, quote, "Their ramble did not appear to have been more than partially agreeable or at all productive of anything useful with regard to the object of the day." It seems that they all spent the time, quote, "walking after each other." And I dare Mr. Crawford. Julia and Mr. Rushworth are described as dissatisfied with a look of gloom on their faces. Austen tells us through Fanny that, quote, "Mr. Crawford and Miss Bertram were much more gay." Also that Mariah could allow Julia to ride home again up front with Mr. Crawford because of her conviction of being really the one preferred, which allows her to be comforted. To have the pair return from their romp in the park looking much more gay, with Mariah feeling preferred and comforted, Austen allows the imaginations of her readers to fill in the blanks.
Austen uses two incredibly audacious literary allusions. Rachel commented on one of them, Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, one of their great seduction poems and something that everybody in the audience would have known. Let me just read 6 lines from the end of that poem. "Now let us sport us while we may, and now like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour than languish in his slow-chapped power, and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life." And, clearly she's alluding to that. Then the other one, which would have been immediately recognizable to an 18th century audience, though not to a contemporary audience, is that strange thing where Maria says, "I can't get out," as the starling said. Well, that's a reference, in fact, a quote from a novel by Lawrence Stern, which was published in 1769, and it's an even more audacious reference. Because journey, and it's an account of the author's wanderings in France and Italy. And in this particular scene, he's visiting the Bastille, which of course is the most notorious prison for locking up the king's enemies. And he visits the Bastille, and on the way out, he thinks he sees a starling locked in a cage, and he thinks he hears the starling say, "I can't get out, I can't get out." And he tries to open the cage, and he fails to do so. But when you think about the imagery there, the Bastille, the starling locked in a cage, and this is what Maria is referring to her own situation. I mean, for her to say that, and it would be, again, an illusion that anybody in the audience, anybody hearing it, anybody in Austen's audience would have instantly recognized. Now, let's turn to the play acting sequence. The young people, after much fruitless deliberation, finally choose a German play, which in its English translation by Elizabeth Inchbald was enormously popular at the time Austen was writing Mansfield Park, a play she could have expected her audience to be familiar with. A literal translation of the German title would be The Love Child. But Mrs. Inchbald changed it to the less scandalous Lover's Vows. Nevertheless, it is a play that all the Bertram children know in their hearts their father would strongly disapprove of. Though only Edmund objects to its choice and initially refuses to join in. To fully appreciate the brilliance of this section of the novel, be sure to read Lover's Vows in Mrs. Inchbald's translation. It's readily available on the internet. You miss so much if you don't read this play. It is such a pleasure to see how thoroughly Austen merges the play and the novel, so that almost everything in the play is in one way or another a commentary on the motivations and actions of the novel's characters. Rachel will now explain how Maria and Henry end up playing Agatha and Frederick, mother and son, in the opening scene from Lover's Vows, a scene that after Rachel's introduction, Jamie and Ryan will perform for us.
The portion of Mansfield Park when Sir Thomas is away really should be entitled When the Cat's Away, the Mice Will Play. With no proper supervision to speak of, 3 of 4 Bertram's siblings go wild during this time, and after a bit even Edmund gets caught up in the excitement. It all starts somewhat innocently, as David has said, for a request for a home theatrical. Austen herself enjoyed these as a young girl and was a great fan of the theater as an adult. However, this takes on some rather improper elements quickly. It is quite certain from the beginning that Sir Thomas would not approve of having his grown daughters who are out play parts with young men who are not immediate family members, if at all. In addition, the play that is chosen, Lover's Vows, is full of plot lines and characters he would not find appropriate for his daughters to play. Fanny sums it up best when she says, The first use Fanny made of her solitude was to take up the volume which had been left on the table, and begin to acquaint herself with the play of which she had heard so much. Her curiosity was all awake, and she ran through it with an eagerness which was suspended only by intervals of astonishment, that it could be chosen in the present instance, that it could be proposed and accepted in a private theater. Agatha and Amelia, the two main women characters in the play, appeared to her in their different ways so totally improper for home representation. The situation of one and the language of the other so unfit to be expressed by any woman of modesty that she could hardly suppose her cousins could be aware of what they were engaging in, and longing to have them roused as soon as possible by the remonstrance which Edmund would certainly make. Certainly, acting together in a play brings about informality, familiarity, and intimacy that would certainly be frowned upon by Sir Thomas or any decent chaperone, which is, of course, exactly why most of the young people are so set upon putting one together. As at Southerton, Austen uses the change of scenery that a play allows in order to propel forward several plot lines and relationships. Austen first uses the issue of casting the play to highlight several complex relationship issues and to solidify the feelings of several characters. The first set of relationships is again, has to do with the Julia Crawford-Maria love triangle, and it comes to a head through the casting issue of the part of Agatha. It all begins when they decide that Mr. Crawford will play Frederick, so the question then becomes, who will play Agatha, his mother, opposite him, Maria or Julia? Whoever plays opposite him will have an excuse to spend hours and days practicing together in close quarters. Each to get the chance to solidify a relationship with Mr. Crawford. And I invite you now to read along on the back there as we closely examine how and by whom this casting question is settled. A short silence followed. Each sister looked anxious, for each felt the best claim to Agatha and was hoping to have it pressed on her by the rest. Henry Crawford, who meanwhile had taken up the play and with seeming carelessness was turning over the first act, soon settled the business. "I must entreat Miss Julia Bertram," said he, "not to engage in the part of Agatha, or it would be the ruin of all my solemnity. You must not, indeed you must not," turning to her. "I could not stand your countenance dressed up in woe and paleness. The many laughs we have had together would infallibly come across me, and Frederick and his knapsack would be obliged to run away." Pleasantly, courteously it was spoken, but the manner was lost in the matter to Julia's feelings. She saw a glance at Maria which confirmed the injury to herself. It was a scheme. It was a trick. She was slighted. Maria was preferred. The smile of triumph which Maria was trying to suppress showed how well it was understood. And before Julia could command herself enough to speak, her brother gave his weight against her too by saying, "Oh yes, Maria must be Agatha." As we can see, Crawford's preference for Maria is revealed here rather painfully and obviously. The complexity of this revelation sets off a chain of events in the novel for Maria and acts to rip apart the relationship between the two sisters. Austen explains, quote, "The sister with whom Julia was used to be on easy terms was now become her greatest enemy. They were alienated from each other," end quote. Julia becomes intensely angry with and jealous of Maria from this point on, and Maria, consumed with overwhelming desire, sends to her word. The time the two of them spend together practicing lines proves to be a catalyst for their mutual attraction, opening a Pandora's box of temptation for them both that will prove difficult to close. As the two sisters battle for the part of Agatha, many modern readers might wonder, apart from the time they will get to spend with Mr. Crawford, why both women are so intent upon playing the part of a mother. First, as you will see in a few moments when we enjoy the first scene of the play, the relationship between Agatha, the mother, and Frederick, the son, is intense, and their devotion to one another is quite sensational. For example, as Agatha describes how Frederick came to be born, it would behoove us to imagine what emotions and ideas it must bring to Mariah's mind to say these words again and again in practice to Mr. Crawford, all while having him clasp her hand to his heart. I had never seen him before. He was a handsome young man, in my eyes a prodigy, for he talked of love and promised me marriage. He was the first man who ever spoke to me on such a subject. His flattery made me vain, and his repeated vows, "Don't look at me, dear Frederick. I can say no more." Frederick, with his eyes cast down, takes her hand and puts it to his heart. Oh, my son, I was intoxicated by the fervent caresses of a young, inexperienced, capricious man, and did not recover from the delirium till it was too late. By the way, when Sir Thomas comes home, that's the exact spot they're in. He has her hand against his heart. They've practiced that one a lot. Obviously, this kind of acting would indeed be intoxicating for Maria as well. Austen's contemporary readers would have been quite familiar with this play, as David said, and would understand the layers of subtlety Austen is using here in having both sisters so determined to play the part with Mr. Crawford. Even more, we should understand that the sisters most likely also want to play this part with Mr. Crawford because Agatha and Frederick are extremely affectionate. Each of the perusal of the play noticed the physical actions involved in the stage directions, as does Mr. Crawford surely as he picks up the play during their casting dispute. Such as when Agatha rises and embraces him and presses him to her breast, and when Frederick leans her against his breast, when he takes her hand and puts it to his heart, and when he embraces her. Throughout the first act, which Maria and Mr. Crawford we are told repeatedly practice day in and day out, the lines and actions given to Agatha and Frederick are intimate, exciting, and passionate. Both Maria and Mr. Crawford become deeply engrossed in one another as they work closely to prepare. Though none but Fanny and Julia notice the perfect situation the two of them have devised for themselves, it is obvious to the reader that Maria is treading dangerously close to the edge of propriety, as well as opening herself and her feelings for Mr. Crawford up to ridicule and exposure as she spends hours of her time with him. As you watch this scene now, please imagine you are watching Maria and Henry Crawford practice these lines and these embraces over and over and over again.
Halt! Stand at ease. It's a very hot day. A draught of good wine will not be amiss. But first, let me consult my purse. This will do for breakfast. The other remains for my dinner. And in the evening, I shall be at home. Ah, halloo, landlord! Who's this? Poor sick woman. She don't beg, but her appearance makes me think she is in want. One always wait till one is asked to give. Shall I go without my breakfast now or lose my dinner? The first I think is best. I don't want a breakfast, for dinner time will soon be here. To do good satisfies both hunger and thirst. Take this, good woman.
Frederick?
Mother! Mother! For God's sake! What is this? How is this? And why do I find my mother thus? Speak.
I cannot speak, dear son. My dear Frederick, the joy is too great. I was not prepared.
Dear mother, compose yourself. Now then, be comforted. Oh, how she trembles. She is fainting.
I'm so weak and my head so giddy. I had nothing to eat all yesterday.
Oh, good heavens. Here's my little money. Take it all. Oh, mother. Mother.
Be patient, good Frederick. Since I see you, I am well, but I have been very ill. So ill, I despaired of ever beholding you again.
Ill? And I was not with you? I will now never leave you more. Look, mother, how tall and strong I have grown. These arms can afford you support. They can and shall procure you subsistence.
I thank you, my dear Frederick.
Don't speak too much, mother. Take your time.
Tell me, dear child, how you have passed
good and bad, Mother. Today, plenty, tomorrow, not so much, and sometimes nothing at all.
You've not written to me this long while.
Dear Mother, consider the great distance I was from you. And then in the time of war, how often letters miscarried? Besides...
No matter, I see you. You have obtained your discharge?
Oh, no, Mother. I have leave of absence only for 2 months, and that for a particular reason. But I will not quit you so soon. Now I find you are in want of my assistance.
No, Frederick. Your visit will make me so well that I shall in a very short time recover my strength to work again. And you must return to your regiment when your furlough is expired. But you told me a leave of absence was granted for a particular reason. What reason?
When I left you finding everything you thought would be necessary for me, but one trifle you forgot, which was the certificate of my birth from the church book. You know, in this country, there is nothing to be done without it. At the time of my parting from you, I little thought it could be of that consequence to me which I have since found it would have been. Once I became tired of a soldier's life, and in the hope I should obtain my discharge, offered myself to a master to learn a profession. But his question was, where is your certificate from the church book of the parish in which you were born? It vexed me that I had it not to produce, for my comrades laughed at my disappointment. My captain behaved kinder, and he gave me leave to come home to fetch it. You see, Mother, here I am.
So you are come for the purpose of fetching your certificate from the church book?
Yes, Mother.
Oh.
What is the matter? For heaven's sake, Mother, tell me what's the matter.
You have no certificate.
No.
No. The laws of Germany excluded you from being registered at your birth, for you are a natural son.
So, and who is my father?
Oh, Frederick, your wild looks are daggers to my heart. Another time.
No, I am still your son, you are still my mother. Only tell me, who is my father?
When we parted 5 years ago, you were too young to be entrusted with the secret of so much importance. But the time has come when I can, in confidence, open my heart and unload that burden which has been long oppressed. And yet, to reveal my errors to my child and sue for his mild judgment on my conduct.
You have nothing to sue for. Explain this mystery.
I will. But my tongue is locked with remorse and shame. You must not look at me.
Not look at you. Cursed be that son who could find his mother guilty, although the world should call her so.
Then listen to me and take note of that castle and of that church. In that village I was born. In that church I was baptized. My parents were poor but reputable farmers. The lady of that castle and estate requested them to let me live with her, and she would provide for me through life. They resigned me, and at the age of 14, I went to my patroness. She took pleasure to instruct me in all kinds of female literature and accomplishments, and 3 happy years passed under her protection, when her only son, who was an officer in the Saxon service, obtained permission to come home. I had never seen him before. He was a handsome young man, in my eyes a prodigy. He talked of love and promised me marriage. He was the first man who had ever spoken to me on such a subject. His flattery made me vain, and his repeated vows of... Don't look at me, Frederick. I can say no more. Oh, my son. I was intoxicated by the fervent caresses of a young, inexperienced, capricious man, and did not recover from the delirium until it was too late.
Go on. Let me know more of my father.
When the time drew near that I could no longer conceal my guilt and shame, my seducer prevailed on me not to expose him to the resentment of his mother. He renewed his former promises of marriage out of death, on which relying, I gave him my word to be secret, and have to this very hour buried his name deep in my heart.
Proceed. Proceed. Give me full information. I will have courage to hear it all.
His leave of absence expired. He returned to his regiment, depending on my promise and well assured of my esteem. As soon as my situation became known, I was questioned and received many severe and went to my parents. But their door was shut against me. My mother indeed wept as she bade me quit her sight forever, but my father wished me increased affliction might befall me.
Be quick with your narrative, or you'll break my heart.
I sought protection from the old clergyman of the parish. He received me with compassion. On my knees, I begged forgiveness for the scandal I had caused to his parishioners, promised amendment. He did not doubt me. Through his recommendation, I went to town and hid in humble lodgings, procured the means of subsistence by teaching to the neighboring children what I had learnt under the tuition of my benefactress. To instruct you, my Frederick, was my care and my delight. And in return for your filial love, I would not thwart your wishes when they led to a soldier's life. But I saw you go from me with an aching heart. Soon after, my health declined, and I was compelled to give up my employment, and by degrees became the object you now see me. But let me add, before I close my calamitous story, that when I left the good old clergyman, taking with me his kind advice and his blessing, I left him with a firm determination to fulfill the vow I had made of repentance and amendment. I have fulfilled it. And now, Frederick, you may look at me again.
But my father all this time? I apprehend he died.
No, he married.
Married?
A woman of virtue, of noble birth and immense fortune. Yet, I had written to him many times and had described your infant innocence and wants. He glanced obliquely at former promises.
No answers to these letters?
Not a word. But in times of war, you know, letters miscarry.
Nor did he ever return to this estate?
No, since the death of his mother in this castle has only been inhabited by servants, for he settled far off as Alsace upon the estate of his wife.
I will... No. Why should I ever know my father if he's a villain? My heart is satisfied with a mother. No, I will not go to him. I will not disturb his peace. I will leave that to task to his conscience. What say you, mother? Can't we do without him? We don't want him. I will write directly to my captain. Let the consequence be what it will. Leave you again, I cannot. Should I be able to get my discharge, I will work all day at the plow and all the night with my pen. It will do, mother. It will do. Heaven's goodness will assist me. It will prosper the endeavors of a dutiful son for the sake of his helpless mother.
Where could we found such another son?
But tell me my father's name, that I may know to shun him.
Baron Wildenheim.
Baron Wildenheim. I shall never forget it. Oh, you're fainting. Your eyes are cast down. What's the matter? Speak, mother.
Nothing particular, only fatigued with talking. I wish to take a little rest.
I think you can now see why Mariah wanted to play this part so badly. And by the way, as Rachel emphasized, all the physicality is written into the text. It's in the stage directions. They didn't invent it. Now, you might be curious as to what part Mr. Rushworth is playing in this play. Well, at Maria's suggestion, or perhaps insistence, he takes the part of Count Castle, and I'm quoting from the play, the flimsy, frivolous coxcomb of the heroine in Failure. By the way, this is another example of Austen's cleverness. Of all the major characters in the play, the only two characters who never appear on stage together are Count Castle and Agatha. The second scene Jamie and Ryan will perform is the scene to be played by Mary Crawford and Edmund Bertram. At first, Edmund refuses to participate in the play, but when his brother announces plans to recruit a young man from the surrounding neighborhood, Edmund changes his mind. His attraction to Mary gets the better of his moral scruples. Both Edmund and Mary are nervous about acting together. Mary so much so that she seeks Fanny out in her own room. And now I'm reading from the book. Am I right? Yes, this is the East Room. My dear Miss Price, I beg your pardon, but I had made my way to you on purpose to entreat your help. Fanny, quite surprised, endeavored to show herself mistress of the room by her civilities, and looked at the bright bars of her empty grate with concern. Thank you, I am quite warm, very warm. Allow me to stay here a little while, and do have the goodness to hear me my third act. I have brought my book, and if you would but rehearse it with me, I should be so obliged. I came here today intending to rehearse it with Edmund by ourselves against the evening. But he is not in the way, and if he were, I do not think I could go through it with him till I have a little speech or two. You will be so good, won't you? Fanny was most civil in her assurances, though she could not give them in a very steady voice. Have you ever happened to look at the part I mean? Continued Miss Crawford, opening her book. Here it is. I did not think much of it at first, but upon my word, there, look at that speech, and that, and that. How am I ever to look him in the face and say such things? Could you do it? But then he is your cousin, which makes all the difference. You must rehearse it with him, that I may fancy you him, and get on by degrees. You have a look of his sometime. Now, what we'll talk about next time, of course, is this scene is even more intense, because unbeknownst to Mary, unbeknownst to Edmund, Fanny is also in love with Edmund. So we have yet another triangle. Mary and Fanny begin to rehearse, but before they are halfway through, Edmund knocks at the door. Not knowing Mary is in the house, he has also come up to solicit Fanny's help. Jamie and Ryan will now perform the scene from Lovers' Vows between Amelia and Anhart that makes our two would-be lovers, Mary Crawford and Edmund Bertram, so embarrassed and apprehensive. Anhalt, by the way, is a clergyman who is Amelia's former tutor. And remember, as I said, Edmund is intending to be a clergyman. You're on.
Why am I so uneasy, so peevish? Who has offended me? I did not mean to come into this room. In the garden I intended to go. No, I will not. Yes, I will. I will just go and look and see if my Oroculus are still in blossom, and if the apple tree is grown which Mr. Hall planted. It's very low-spirited. Something must be the matter. Why do I cry? Am I not well? Good morning, my dear Sir. Mr. Anhalt, I meant to say, I beg pardon.
Well, never mind, Miss Wildenheim. I don't just like to hear you call me as you just did. for matrimony?
All things I don't know and don't understand are quite indifferent to me.
Well, for that very reason, I am sent to you to explain the good and the bad of which matrimony is composed.
I beg
When two sympathetic hearts meet in the marriage state, matrimony may be called a happy life. When such a wedded pair find thorns in their path, each will be eager, for the sake of the other, to tear them from the root. Where they have to mount hills or wind the labyrinth, the most experienced will lead the way and be a guide to his companion. Patience and love will accompany in their journey, while melancholy and discord they leave far behind. Hand in hand they pass on from morning till evening, through their summer's day till the night of age draws on, and the sleep of death overtakes the one. The other, weeping and mourning, yet looks forward to the bright region, where he shall meet his still surviving partner among trees and flowers which themselves have planted in fields of eternal verdure.
You may tell my father I will marry.
The picture is pleasing, but I must beg you not to forget that there is another on the same subject. When convenience and fair opinion, joined by folly and ill humor, forge the fetters of matrimony, they gall with their weight the man. Discontented with each other, at variance in opinions, their mutual aversion increases with the years they live together. They contend most where they should most unite, torment where they should most soothe. In this rugged way, choked with the weeds of suspicion, jealousy, anger, and hatred, they take their daily journey to one of these also, sleep in death. The other then lifts up his dejected head and calls out in acclamations of joy, "Oh, liberty, dear liberty!"
I will not marry.
You mean to say you will not fall in love?
Oh, no. I am in love.
Are in love? And with the Count?
I wish I was.
Why so?
Because he would, perhaps, love me again.
Who is there that would not?
Would you?
I...
The very person to whom I have put the question.
What do you mean?
I'm glad you don't understand me. I'm afraid I had spoken too plain.
I understand you. As to that, I am not dull.
Oh, I know you are not. As you have for a long time instructed me, why should not I now begin to teach you?
Teach me what?
Whatever I know and you don't.
There are some things I had rather never know.
So you may remember, as I said when you began to teach me mathematics, I said I'd rather not know it, but now I have learnt it, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure. And perhaps, who can tell, but I might be able to teach something as pleasant to you as resolving a problem is to me.
The woman herself is a problem.
And I'll teach you to make her out.
You teach.
Why not? None but a woman can teach the science of herself. And though I own I am very young, a young woman may be just as agreeable for a tutoress as an old one. I'm sure I always learnt faster from you than the old clergymen who taught me before you came.
That is nothing to the subject.
What is the subject?
Love.
Come then! Teach it me! Teach it me as you taught me geography, languages, and other important things. Ah, you won't! You know you've already taught me that and you won't begin again.
You misconstrue. You misconceive everything I say or do. The subject I came to you upon was marriage.
Very proper subject from the man who has taught me love. I accept the proposal.
Again, you misconceive and confound me.
I see how it is. You have no inclination to experience with me the good parts of matrimony. I'm not the female with whom you'd like to walk hand in hand up hills, through labyrinths, with whom you'd like to root up thorns, and with whom you'd like to delight to plant lilies and roses. No, you'd rather call out, "Oh, liberty, dear liberty!"
Why do you force from me what is villainous to own? I love you more than life. Oh, Amelia, which poets picture, no one but you. But as the world is charged, as the world is changed, your birth and fortune make our union impossible. To preserve the character and more the feelings of an honest man, I would not marry you without the consent of your father. And could I? Dare I propose it to him?
He has commanded me never to conceal or disguise the truth. subject of the count will force me to speak plainly, and this will be the most proper time, while he can compare the merit of his oath.
I conjure you not to think of exposing yourself and me to his resentment.
It is my father's will that I should marry. It is my father's wish to see me happy. If you love me, as you say, I will marry, and I will be happy, but only with you. I will tell him this, and at first he will start, then he will grow angry, then be in a passion, and in his passion he will call me undutiful, but he will soon recollect himself and resume his usual smile, saying, well, well, if he love you, and you love him, in the name of heaven, let it be. And I shall hug him round the neck, kiss his hands, run away from him, and fly to you. It will soon be known that I am your bride. The whole village will come to wish me joy, and heaven's blessing will follow.
Another scene equally inappropriate for the two characters involved in a different sort of way. I think just listening to these wonderful actors do these scenes, it becomes very obvious that this is dynamite stuff that these young people should not be indulging themselves with. We've got just a very short few minutes. Are there any questions or comments? I want to emphasize this is just the first volume and just the subplots. This book is so rich, so complex, and we haven't even begun to explore Fanny Price, which will be the focus of the next session. Fanny Price, the novel's heroine, is a heroine who could not be more different from Elizabeth Bennet, and many readers dismiss the novel and blame Austen for not giving us another heroine like Elizabeth. Such readers are extremely short-sighted. Rachel and I will argue next week that Fanny is Austen's most richly developed and fully realized heroine. But we've, in the very few minutes remaining, are there any questions or comments about what we did today? Yes.
What was the author of The Lover's Vows that you thought was the best?
Well, it's not the author you want to be concerned about, it's the translator,
Right.
Elizabeth Inchbald. It's by far the most common translation, and you can find it on the internet. And you've just got to read that play, or you can see how much you're missing. I mean, everything about that play is a comment on the characters in the novel. Any other? Yes.
When we did Mansfield Park drawn to Austen, and was that ever recorded or kept?
There's the person who did it. Do you know the answer to that, Stephanie?
I was actually looking at all of those links recently, and I can't recall. I have a feeling that that one did not record, but it might have. If you poke around on our website and look up past events, you can actually see most of the programs, recordings or documents from most of the programs from the How Ostentatious series, including Rachel's wonderful talk about etiquette.
Rachel gave that
And
presentation,
Victoria England,
and it was a wonderful presentation. That's ostensibly why they were at Southerton, because Mr. Rushworth wanted to improve his estate, meaning completely redesign his whole garden and park. Any other questions? Yes.
And I don't have much of a consistent question. I've been watching the movies of Mansfield Park, and there's
It's very what?
It's a very detailed representation of the novel. So, it's on Netflix, and they're only going to have it on there until February 1st, if anybody wants to watch it. And I've always been so disappointed with the person who plays Fanny in the Mansfield Park series. She's such a boring character. It's amazing. I'm looking forward to February to have you.
Well, the reason why is because, as we're going to demonstrate in February, it's from Fanny's. I mean, Fanny is quiet. She doesn't say much, but she observes everything. And we see this from Fanny's point. She's struck the right thing. She's trying to deal with all these conflicts in her life, but it's inside her. And that, in my opinion, all Austen's novels are impossible to dramatize. But this one is the most impossible, because what makes Fanny so interesting is her inner life. Do you want to comment any more on that? Or yeah, go ahead.
Well, I encourage you, as you continue to read, to kind of think of different personality traits in your own friends, perhaps, because that has helped me over the years to enjoy Fanny. I think of her as someone who isn't the center of attention. She's not super outgoing. She's the type of person who's quieter and more introverted, but she has so much depth to her. She's someone you want to go and sit with and get to know. So as you read the next few volumes, take time to get to know Fanny. I think it'll be worth your while.
Any other questions? Yes.
I've read the book a couple of times, but I have to say, seeing this performance really enriched that experience. Now I'm going to take another look at it.
These two, as you've just learned, are extremely good. I don't know how many of you saw the Pride and Prejudice adaptation or the real thing, but these two are wonderful, and they demonstrated it here this afternoon, and we're so grateful. It was just delightful. Okay. Yes, sorry.
I just wanted to say I also enjoyed the performances so much, but I don't think it was fair for you to have Mr. Darcy play Mr. Collins.
Now, I want to address that, because I remember having a telephone conversation with its two when we were talking about what scenes to do, and I said, I'm almost certain that every actor who's ever portrayed Darcy on the stage would really rather be Collins, and Ryan just erupted in laughter. So I just wanted to give him his wish. Okay, I think, are there any other questions? I think this is probably a good place. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So every time I read it, I have a different opinion of Mary Crawford, whether she's a shallow, evil person, or whether just actually a nice person kind of gone another way. So I'd be curious to get some opinions on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, why don't do you want to answer that
You are
question?
the Mary Crawford.
Mary
You
Crawford
love
is
Mary
another one of these incredibly complex people. I mean, I think, and my wife disagrees with me, by the way, I think that Mary Crawford really does love Edmund, and that she's comes very, very close to accepting him at one point. But she's torn. She's conflicted. This is the best man she's ever met. I mean, he's completely unlike the kind of people he finds she's exposed to in London, and she recognizes his virtues. But damn it, she doesn't want to be stuck in the country. Her selfishness, but there's a point, and maybe we'll talk about this next time, when I think she's really on the verge of accepting him. I'm not saying that the marriage would work out. I'm not saying that she'd be a good wife, but she's just another one of these, she's an extremely complex character, and I think that's why you vacillate back and forth about what you think of her.